Girls like you don't last long here. The words hung in the air like smoke, slow, deliberate, meant to burn. 22 years old, first real job, first morning in a real office. And a man with a corner view in a custom suit just looked her in the eye and told her she didn't belong. Madison Carter didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked back to her desk, picked up her phone, and dialed the one number she hadn't planned on using today. Her father answered on the second ring. "Dad, I think I need you here." 3 seconds of silence. Then, "Where are you?" Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The morning Madison Carter walked into Black Ridge Outdoor Industries for the first time, she wore a navy blazer she'd ironed 3 times the night before. That detail mattered to her, not because she was vain, because she understood something that most people her age hadn't figured out yet, that the world makes judgments in the first 15 seconds. And once a judgment is made, it takes 10 times the effort to undo it. She was 22 years old. She had a business management degree she'd earned while working 30 hours a week at a hardware store. She had no connections, no family money, no LinkedIn network filled with people who went to the right schools. What she had was a resume she'd revised 47 times and a work ethic that her mother once described as almost frightening. Black Ridge Outdoor Industries was a big deal in Montana. They made equipment, hiking gear, hunting supplies, survival tools, and they sold it across 23 states. The kind of company that had its name on the side of trucks and sponsored local rodeos and wrote checks to charities at Christmas time. So their name ended up in the paper. From the outside, it looked like a place where hard work meant something. Madison had done her research. She always did. What the research didn't tell her was what happened behind the glass doors once the cameras stopped rolling. She found out fast. The receptionist who greeted her that morning, a woman in her late 40s named Donna, gave her a smile that was warm but brief, the kind of smile that carries something unspoken behind it. Madison noticed but didn't press. She signed in, clipped on her visitor badge, and followed a young HR coordinator named Trevor up 2 flights of stairs to the main floor. Trevor was polite, efficient. He walked quickly and talked quickly and answered her questions with the kind of careful precision that told her he'd been trained to say exactly the right things and nothing more. "Mr. Whitmore likes to meet new hires personally," Trevor told her as they walked. "Just a few minutes, standard procedure." "Great," Madison said. "I'd love to meet him." Trevor glanced at her sideways for just a moment, a flicker. Gone before she could read it. She filed it away. The executive floor was different from the rest of the building. Quieter, carpeted, the kind of quiet that felt less like calm and more like caution, the silence of people choosing their words before they said them. Richard Whitmore's office sat at the end of a long hallway behind a door that was always kept slightly open. Madison would later learn that the open door was intentional. Not because Richard believed in an open door policy, but because he liked to know when people were coming. She knocked. "Come in." His voice was the kind that had learned to fill a room without trying. Low, measured, accustomed to being heard. Madison stepped inside and immediately clocked the room, the framed magazine covers on the wall, the glass desk with nothing unnecessary on it, the chair positioned slightly higher than the chairs across from it. Small details, deliberate details. Richard Whitmore was 61 years old and looked like a man who had decided at some point in his 40s that he would spend the rest of his life reminding people that he had won. He was trim gray at the temples, dressed in a charcoal suit with a pocket square. He looked up from his phone when she entered, but not immediately. He let her stand there for 4 full seconds before he acknowledged her. 4 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in a room like that, with a man like that, 4 seconds is a message. Madison kept her expression neutral. "Madison Carter," he said, setting the phone face down. "Sit. Not please sit, not welcome, just sit." She sat. "You came in through HR," he said. He was already looking at a paper on his desk, her resume, she assumed. "Management track. You've never worked in this industry before." "No, sir," she said, "but I've worked in supply chain logistics team coordination, and I read the resume," he said flatly. She stopped. He looked up at her then, really looked. The kind of look that was designed to make a person feel assessed rather than seen. "You're 22, he said. "Yes." "That's young. It is, she agreed. I'm aware of that. Something shifted in his expression. Not displeasure exactly, more like mild curiosity, the way someone looks at a puzzle they expect to solve quickly. Montana girl, he asked. Born and raised, she said. Family in the area. Yes, my father lives about 40 minutes out. He nodded slowly the way people nod when they're thinking about something other than what you just said. Then he stood, straightened his jacket and said, We'll see how you do. That was it, the entire meeting. Trevor was waiting for her in the hallway. He walked her to her desk without comment. She told herself the meeting was fine, normal, that powerful men were often curt and that she shouldn't read too much into it. She was wrong to tell herself that. Her first 2 weeks were objectively speaking good. She was fast, she was organized. She caught a pricing error in a vendor contract that saved the company $11,000. Not because anyone asked her to look at it, but because she was reading through the files to understand how the department worked and the number didn't add up. Her supervisor, a quiet woman named Janet, had looked at Madison's memo with wide eyes and said, I'll pass this along. Madison never heard about it again. She didn't push. She understood that in a new job, you didn't make noise about what you found. You built trust first. You proved you belonged, then you spoke. But she watched. She watched how Richard walked the floor, how the energy in a room changed when his footsteps were heard in the corridor, how people straightened their backs and stopped personal conversations and became very interested in their computer screens. She watched how Donna, the receptionist, always seemed to know when he was coming before anyone else did, and how she always had coffee ready. She watched how Trevor never made direct eye contact with Richard during meetings, how Janet answered every question with a slight upward inflection, like every statement was actually an apology. And she watched how a man named Gary, a warehouse supervisor in his mid-50s who had worked at Black Ridge for 19 years, got passed over for a department lead promotion in favor of a 26-year-old who had been hired 3 months ago and who happened to play golf with Richard's son. That was the moment Madison's quiet watching shifted into something with more weight behind it. And she didn't say anything, not yet. She asked Janet about it, carefully framing it as a process question. How were internal promotions typically handled? What factors were considered? What was the timeline? Janet looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, Madison, there are some things here that just are the way they are. Okay, Madison said, but she wasn't done. The confrontation, because that's what it became, though. Madison never intended it that way, happened on a Thursday. Richard had announced that morning that the company would be restructuring its overtime pay policy for warehouse staff, effective the following pay period. The announcement was made via a 2-paragraph internal memo that was distributed without any prior notice, without any consultation, and without any explanation beyond the phrase, in alignment with updated operational priorities. What it meant in plain language was that warehouse workers who were currently earning time and a half for hours over 40 would now earn straight time for the first 4 overtime hours in any given week. It was a pay cut, dressed up in corporate language to look like an administrative adjustment. Gary pulled Madison aside near the break room that afternoon. You see the memo, he asked. His voice was low, but his jaw was tight. I saw it, she said. That's almost $300 a month for some of these guys, Gary said. We've got people supporting families on that overtime. It's not a bonus, it's how they pay their bills. Madison knew that. She'd run the numbers herself within 10 minutes of reading the memo, the same way she ran any number that crossed her desk. Has anyone talked to HR, she asked. Gary let out a short breath. HR is Richard's HR. You've been here 2 weeks, Madison. You know how this works already. She did know. That was the problem. She went back to her desk. She sat there for 7 minutes, which was how long it took her to make a decision she had already half made before Gary walked away. Then she went to Richard's office. The door was open. She knocked anyway. I was on a call. He held up one finger, the universal signal for wait, and she stood in the doorway and waited. The call went on for 3 more minutes. When he hung up, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the first day. Assessing, already slightly impatient. I wanted to talk about the overtime memo, she said. She kept her voice level. Professional. What about it? I think there may be some unintended consequences for the warehouse staff, she said. She had his numbers ready. She put them on his desk, a single page clearly organized. Some of these workers are relying on that differential to cover basic expenses. A change this significant implemented without notice. Madison, he said. He hadn't looked at the page. Who asked for your opinion on compensation policy? Nobody, she said. But when I see something that I think could hurt people and hurt the company, I think it's my job to bring it forward. He leaned back in his chair. You've been here 2 weeks. I have, she said. And in 2 weeks, I've learned that the people in that warehouse care about this company. They show up, they work hard, and I think they deserve to be treated. That's enough. His voice hadn't changed volume. It didn't need to. The two words landed like a door closing. Madison stopped. The silence stretched. Then Richard said, You should remember your place. She heard the words. She processed them. She felt them. I know my place, she said, and her voice was completely steady. I'm an employee of this company. So are the people in that warehouse. We both deserve to be treated with basic respect. Something moved across his face. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. You're here because we gave you an opportunity, he said. You might want to be careful about how quickly you start telling us how we should run it. I'm not telling you how to run it, she said. I'm asking you to consider. I said that's enough. He picked up his phone. The conversation was over by his decision, not hers. Madison stood for another moment. She picked up her page from his desk. He hadn't touched it, and she walked out. She made it back to her desk. She sat down. She opened a file on her computer that had nothing to do with any of this, and she stared at it without reading it for about 45 seconds. Then she felt it, that slow, hot crawl of humiliation that doesn't announce itself loudly. It just settles in the awareness that you were dismissed, not disagreed with, not debated, dismissed. Like your words didn't carry enough weight to deserve a real response. She had been in that office 2 weeks. She had caught an $11,000 error. She had stayed late 3 times because the work needed doing. She had done everything right, and she had just been told to remember her place. She kept her face neutral for the rest of the afternoon. She answered emails. She finished a report. She said goodbye to Janet at 5:15. She got to her car. She sat in the parking lot for a while. Then she called her father. Cole Carter answered on the second ring the way he always did when Madison called. She was his only child, and he had answered on the second ring since she was old enough to have a phone. First ring meant nothing because first ring could be a pocket dial. Second ring was real. Hey kid, he said. His voice was the same as it had always been. Unhurried, a little rough around the edges. The voice of a man who'd spent 30 years working with his hands before the business took over. She had always loved that about her father's voice. It sounded like the Montana ground, solid. Hey, she said. He waited. Cole Carter was a man who understood the value of silence. Dad, she said, after a moment, I think I need you here. 3 seconds. Where are you? Still in the parking lot at work, she said. I'm okay, She stopped. Tried again. Something happened today and I don't. Another stop. Madison. Yeah. Just tell me. So she did. She told him about the memo. She told him about Gary and the warehouse workers. She told him about going to Richard's office and what she'd said and what he'd said back. She told him about remember your place. She told him about the way Richard had picked up his phone like she'd stopped being worth looking at. When she finished, there was a brief quiet. He said, remember your place, Cole repeated. Yes. To you. Yes, Dad. Another pause. Shorter this time. Okay, he said. I'm coming. You don't have to. Madison, I know I don't have to. I want to. Give me 20 minutes. She opened her mouth to argue because that was what she did. She argued, she negotiated, she found her own solutions. But something about today, about that office, about the way Richard had looked at her like she was a problem, he'd already decided to ignore something about all of it, had stripped her down a little further than she wanted to admit. So she said, okay. She stayed in the parking lot. She watched the last employees file out of the building. She watched the lights on the upper floor stay on. Richard was still up there, she assumed still in his office, with its view and its silence completely unconcerned. She thought about what she would have done differently. She came up with nothing. She had been respectful. She had been prepared. She had brought data. She had asked, not demanded, not accused. She had asked for him to consider something. And she had been told to know her place. That was the part she kept coming back to. Not the anger she could handle anger. not the dismissal she'd been dismissed before. It was the word place, because place implied that there was a hierarchy so established, so obvious, so unquestionable that it didn't even need to be explained. It implied that she had overstepped something invisible and fundamental simply by having an opinion in a room where he sat. She was still thinking about that when she heard it. The sound came before the sight, a low, steady rumble that built around as it turned off the main road and into the parking lot. Not one engine, several. She looked up. 3 motorcycles. Black, moving in easy formation, the kind of ease that comes from years of riding together. They pulled into the lot and slowed, and the engines cut one by one, and the sound folded away, and in its place was the kind of quiet that feels significant. Cole got off his bike in the way he always got off his bike, unhurried, deliberate, like every movement was a decision. He was 60 years old, and he still moved like a younger man. Not fast, just certain. He wore jeans and boots and a black leather vest over a dark Henley, and on the back of the vest was the patch she had grown up seeing on the back of that vest her whole life. The death's head, the arc of the name above it. The California bottom rocker. The patch that meant something everywhere it appeared, that carried weight that most people only understood from a distance. 2 men flanked him. She recognized them. Bobby, who had known her father since before she was born, and a younger man named Cruz, who had started coming around the shop about 3 years ago. They hung back near the bikes without being asked to. They knew when Cole needed space. Cole walked toward her car, and Madison got out. And when she stood up, he looked at her. Really looked at her the way only fathers look at their children when they're trying to figure out how bad it actually is. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm embarrassed that I called you." "Don't be." "Dad, I'm 22. I'm supposed to be able to handle this myself." Cole tilted his head slightly. "Madison, do you think I called you every time I needed somebody when I was 22? She considered that. "No," she admitted. "I called your grandfather," he said, "and his father called his father before that. That's not weakness. That's family." He paused. "Now, are you ready to go back in there?" She looked at the building. The lights were still on upstairs. She thought about Richard Whitmore and his open door and his phone and his "remember your place." She thought about Gary in the break room with his tight jaw and his $300 a month. She thought about Janet and her apologetic upward inflection, and Trevor with his careful words, and the receptionist Donna whose warm smile carried something unspoken in it. "Yeah," Madison said. "I'm ready." Cole nodded once. "Then let's go." The lobby of Black Ridge Outdoor Industries at 5:45 on a Thursday evening was not entirely empty. There were still a handful of people, a young woman at the front desk covering for Donna, 2 employees from the design team who were gathering their things, a security guard named Phil who was 63 years old and had worked the lobby desk for 11 years and had seen some things in that time, but not quite this. Not a 60-year-old man in a Hells Angels vest walking through the front door like he owned the building. The young woman at the front desk, her name was Kylie, and she had been with the company for 4 months, looked up and then looked again, the way your eyes do when they catch something they weren't prepared for. Cole didn't stop at the desk. He looked around the lobby, oriented himself, and started for the elevator. "Excuse me," Kylie said, her voice coming out a little smaller than she intended. Do you have a badge or?" Cole stopped. He turned toward her with a completely calm expression. "I'm here to see Richard Whitmore," he said. "My name is Cole Carter. My daughter Madison works here." Kylie looked at Madison, who had followed her father in. "He's not Mr. Whitmore, usually doesn't see anyone without an appointment." "That's all right," Cole said. "I'll wait." "And said it the way you say a thing that's already decided." Kylie picked up the phone. Richard Whitmore did not come down immediately. Richard Whitmore kept them waiting for 11 minutes, which Madison would later recognize as a deliberate choice, a power move so automatic by now that he probably wasn't even fully conscious of it anymore. Making people wait was a form of control. It established who mattered more. Cole sat in the lobby and looked at his phone. He appeared completely unbothered. He responded to 2 messages. He checked something, put the phone back in his pocket, and looked around the lobby with the mild interest of a man in a waiting room. Madison sat beside him and tried to do the same thing. She was less successful. Her knee was not bouncing. She had enough discipline not to let it bounce, but it wanted to. "Stop thinking about it," Cole said without looking at her. I'm not You're going over the whole conversation again, he said. I can tell. She was. I just keep thinking about whether I said the wrong thing. Did you say anything false? No. Did you say anything disrespectful? No. Then you said the right thing, he said simply. How it was received is his problem. 11 minutes after Kylie made the call, Richard Whitmore stepped out of the elevator. He had changed something about himself. Madison couldn't immediately identify what it was, but his energy was different coming out of that elevator than it had been in his office earlier. His office was his territory, and he moved through it with the absolute authority of a man who had never had reason to question it. The lobby was less his. There were other people here, people who could see, people who weren't subject to the same hierarchy, and something in how he carried himself had recalibrated just enough to show it. He saw Cole and stopped, just for a beat, just long enough for something to move across his face. Not fear, not yet, but something cautious and calculating. Then he moved forward. Mr. Carter, he said. He extended his hand. Richard Whitmore, Madison has told me about you. She hasn't told me about you, Cole said, shaking it once brief. Not until this afternoon. The words landed with precision, not hostile, not aggressive, just precise. Richard's jaw set slightly. I understand you wanted to speak with me, Richard said. He gestured toward the small conference room off the lobby, the one with the glass wall that everyone on the first floor could see into. He probably thought it was a neutral territory. Madison thought he had chosen wrong. That works, Cole said. They sat. Richard took the head of the table by instinct. Cole sat at the side and didn't appear to notice or care where he'd sat. Mr. Carter. Richard began slipping into the practiced cadence of a man who had managed 1,000 uncomfortable conversations from a position of power. I want to reassure you that your daughter is a valued member of our team. She's new. She's learning how we do things here. Why was she spoken to the way she was, Cole said. Simple, direct, no preamble. Richard paused. I'm not sure what she's told you, but she told me she raised a concern about a policy affecting her coworkers, Cole said. She told me she was dismissed. She told me she was told to remember her place. He let that sit. Is that accurate? Richard looked at Madison briefly, then back at Cole. She was told that decisions about company policy aren't in her area of responsibility. That's not what I asked, Cole said. Silence. Cole said, did you tell my daughter to remember her place? Richard's eyes had hardened. He was recalibrating again, deciding how much this man needed to be taken seriously, deciding what leverage he had, deciding how to reestablish the position he was accustomed to sitting in. I told her, Richard said carefully, that 2 weeks on the job is not the appropriate moment to challenge executive decisions. And the phrase, remember your place, Cole said. Did you use that phrase? A pause, then it may have come up, yes. Cole nodded, slowly. Mr. Whitmore, he said, and his voice had not changed at all. Still unhurried, still measured, still the voice of a man who had never felt the need to make his point by volume. My daughter drove 4 hours each way for her interview. She studied this company for 3 months before she applied. She found an error in your vendor contracts in her first 2 weeks that saved your company $11,000. He paused. Did you know that? Richard said nothing. She's not here because she doesn't know what she's doing, Cole said. She came to you with a concern. She came prepared. She came respectful, and you told her to know her place. He leaned forward just slightly. I'm here because I want to understand why a man with your position thought that was the appropriate way to talk to anybody, let alone my daughter. The room was very quiet, and that was when Richard Whitmore made the mistake that would cost him everything. He leaned back in his chair, and he looked at Cole, at the vest, at the patch, at the man inside the leather, and he said, Mr. Carter, with all due respect, this is a place of business. I don't answer to a man who shows up in that. He gestured at the vest. I suggest you take your concerns somewhere else. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he said, all right. He stood. He buttoned his jacket, then seemed to remember he wasn't wearing one and stopped. And the almost gesture was somehow more powerful than the gesture would have been. He looked at Madison. Call Janet tonight, he said quietly. And whoever else you trust in that building, tell them to check their emails in the morning. Madison looked at him. Okay, she said. Richard was still sitting, watching them with the look of a man who had just won an argument and wasn't yet sure why he didn't feel like he'd won. Cole turned back to him at the door. One more thing, he said. You mentioned this is a place of business. He paused. So is mine, has been for 23 years. Might be worth knowing one of your largest equipment suppliers is a company out of Billings called Ridgecrest Supply. Richard blinked. I own Ridgecrest, Cole said. He walked out. The lobby was quiet. Madison looked at her father's back as he moved toward the door, and she thought about the $11,000 error and the 19-year employee passed over for a golf buddy and the memo about overtime and the open door that was never actually open. And she thought about all the Janets and Trevors and Garys who had said nothing for so long because no one had come in from the outside and said clearly and calmly, I see what's happening here. She followed her father out into the evening air. Behind her through the glass wall of the conference room, she could see Richard Whitmore still sitting at the head of the table. For the first time, he looked small in it. Cole Carter drove home that night without saying much. That was the thing about Cole that most people misread. They saw the vest, the patch, the motorcycles, and they assumed the man inside was loud, impulsive, the kind of man who settled things with volume. But Madison had grown up watching her father operate, and she knew the truth. Cole Carter got quieter, the more serious something became. The angrier he was, the calmer his voice. The more he was thinking, the less he said out loud. So when he pulled out of the Black Ridge parking lot and rode home in near total silence, Madison wasn't fooled. She followed in her own car, watching his taillights ahead of her on the highway, and she understood that her father had not finished with this. Not even close. She was right. By the time she got to his house, a wide single-story place outside of town, that Cole had built half of himself over 3 summers, he already had his laptop open on the kitchen table and a cup of coffee going. Bobby and Cruz had peeled off at the highway. It was just the two of them now, the way it had been for most of Madison's life. Her mother had left when Madison was 9. Not dramatically, not violently, just slowly, and then all at once, the way some departures happen. Cole had never spoken badly about her to Madison. He had also never pretended the absence didn't exist. He had simply become both things at once, the father and the steady constant, and he had done it without making Madison feel like a burden for needing him to. She sat down across from him at the table. What are you doing? She asked. Looking up Black Ridge's public filings, he said, not looking up. They're incorporated in Montana. Board of Directors is listed. Dad, their last annual report was filed 14 months ago. That's unusual. Companies their size file annually like clockwork. Dad, he looked up. You don't have to do this, she said. What you said in there about Ridgecrest, that was enough. He knows now. Maybe that's all it takes. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Madison, he said, how many people do you think that man has spoken to the way he spoke to you today? She opened her mouth, closed it. Because you've been there 2 weeks, Cole said. And you already know about Gary. You already know about Janet. You already know about the overtime memo. He paused. You didn't learn all that from 2 weeks of reading company policy. You learned it because people told you, people who trusted you enough to talk. He turned the laptop slightly to face her. That means they haven't been able to talk to anybody else. She looked at the screen, then at her father. What are you going to do? She asked. Tonight, Cole said. Nothing. Tonight I'm going to make sure I understand exactly who Richard Whitmore is and what he's built. Because when you walk into a room with a man like that a second time, you walk in knowing more than he thinks you know. He reached for his coffee. And tomorrow that depends on what we find. Madison pulled the laptop toward herself and started reading. They stayed up until past midnight. What they found was not on its surface dramatic. It was the kind of thing that looks like paperwork until you understand what the paperwork means. A board that had seen 3 resignations in 18 months. A VP of operations who had left the company abruptly the previous spring with no public explanation. A harassment complaint filed with the Montana Department of Labor that had been marked as resolved, a resolution achieved, Madison noted, through a settlement agreement that almost certainly included a non-disclosure clause. A pattern of turnover in the warehouse and logistics departments that, when you grafted against company hiring data, showed something striking. Black Ridge was not growing, it was cycling, hiring and losing people at a rate that quietly drained institutional knowledge and left behind only the people too afraid or too committed to leave. Madison stared at the turnover graph for a long time. He's been doing this for years, she said quietly. Cole didn't answer right away. He was reading something else, a local business journal article from 4 years ago that quoted Richard Whitmore at a Montana Chamber of Commerce event. He talks very well, Cole said, in public. He turned the laptop so she could see the quote. Richard Whitmore in the article was discussing the importance of investing in people, the importance of building workplace culture, the importance of treating employees as the company's greatest resource. Madison read it once, then she read it again. Then she pushed the laptop back across the table because she didn't want to look at it anymore. Get some sleep, Cole said. You've got work tomorrow. I don't know if I can walk back in there tomorrow, she admitted. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and saying it made it more real than she wanted it to be. Cole looked at her. Yes, you can. He's going to know you talked to me tonight. He's going to know whatever we're doing, he's going to make it harder. Probably, Cole said. And you think I should go in anyway? I think, Cole said, that if you don't go in tomorrow, he wins something he didn't earn. And I raised you to make people earn what they take from you. He leaned back. But I'll tell you something else. You won't be walking in there alone tomorrow, even if it looks like you are. She didn't fully understand that yet. She would. The drive back to her apartment took 20 minutes. She spent most of it on the phone with Janet, who picked up on the third ring with the cautious energy of a person who had been thinking about whether to call. I heard something happened today, Janet said carefully. I went to his office, Madison said, about the overtime memo. A long pause. Madison, Janet said very quietly. I know, Madison said, but Janet, how long has this been going on? The memo, the promotions, the all of it. How long has it been like this? Silence on the other end. A different kind of silence than Cole's silence. Cole's silence was thinking. Janet's silence was measuring, calculating how much it cost to say the truth out loud to someone she barely knew. A long time, Janet finally said. How long? Another pause. Since before I got here, and I've been here 9 years. Madison absorbed that. 9 years. Did anyone ever try to, she started. Yes, Janet said. Flat, final. What happened? They left, Janet said. Or they were let go. Or they stayed and stopped trying. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. Something underneath it was exhausted in the particular way that comes not from one hard day, but from years of small surrenders. Madison, why are you asking me this? Because I think something might be changing, Madison said, and I want to know if you'd be willing to talk. A very long pause. To who? Janet asked. I don't know yet, Madison said honestly, but I think it starts with us talking. Janet didn't answer immediately. Madison waited. Call me tomorrow, Janet said finally. After 9. I will, Madison said. She hung up and pulled into her parking lot and sat in her car and thought about 9 years. 9 years of small surrenders. 9 years of Janet's upward inflection and careful phrasing and eyes that knew more than they said. She thought about what it cost a person to stay somewhere like that for 9 years. She thought about what it cost them to hope one more time that something might change. She wasn't going to waste that. She went inside and set her alarm for 6. She slept 4 hours. When she woke up, there were 2 texts on her phone. The first was from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Cruz. Coley had given him her number, and the message said only, "Your dad says check your email." The second text was from her father, directly sent at 5:52 in the morning. It said, "I made some calls last night. People owed me. Don't be surprised today." She stared at that for a while. Then she checked her email and she read what Cole had sent, and she put her phone face down on the counter and stood in her kitchen and breathed for a minute. Her father had spent the night doing more than reading public filings. He had made calls, not threatening calls. Cole Carter had not called anyone to threaten anyone. What he had done was something more surgical and more lasting than a threat. He had called people. He knew people. He'd done business with people who'd worked with him for years. People who sat on committees and boards and advisory councils in ways that Cole had always downplayed, but never entirely walked away from. And he had told them what had happened to his daughter. And he had told them what he'd found in those public filings. And he had asked quietly whether anyone else had heard similar things about Black Ridge Outdoor Industries and its CEO. He had received 7 responses by 5 in the morning. 7 people who had things to say. One of them was a former Black Ridge board member who had resigned 15 months ago. His name was Daniel Hargrove, and his response to Cole's message had been 4 sentences long and had contained the phrase, "I have documentation." Madison read that phrase 3 times, then she got dressed and went to work. The morning was strange. The quality of strangeness was not the loud, dramatic kind. It was the quiet kind The kind where everything looks the same on the surface, but something underneath has shifted, and the people who can feel shifts know that something is different without being able to say exactly what. Richard was in his office when she arrived. The door was open as always. She walked past it without stopping, went to her desk, sat down, and opened her computer. She felt his attention like a change in air pressure. She didn't look up. Trevor stopped by her desk at 9:15 with the automatic pleasantness of a man who had been trained to be pleasant. "Morning, Madison. Mr. Whitmore wanted me to let you know there's a staff meeting at 10. "Thanks," she said. Trevor lingered for a moment. "You okay?" She looked up at him. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were doing something more complicated. "I'm fine," she said. "Trevor, how long have you worked here?" He blinked. 4 years. "Do you like it?" The careful neutrality flickered. "It's a good company," he said with the upward inflection she'd first heard from Janet. She nodded. "Okay." He walked away. She watched him go, and she thought 4 years of that. The staff meeting happened in the large conference room on the second floor, the one with the long table and the projection screen and the view of the mountains that everyone faced away from because the screen was on the other wall. Richard stood at the head of the table and spoke for 22 minutes about company direction and market positioning and the importance of operational efficiency, and none of what he said was technically untrue, and all of it was delivered in the fluent, confident manner of a man who had given a version of the same speech 50 times and had never once been challenged in the room while giving it. Madison sat near the middle of the table and listened. Not to the content, she'd absorbed the content in the first 4 minutes, but to the room. The way people held themselves, the way eyes moved, the way Gary, sitting 3 seats down from her, had his hands flat on the table in front of him, with the particular stillness of a man who was gripping something invisible. When Richard finished, he asked if there were questions. 3 seconds of silence, the standard buffer, the silence that people left because they had learned that questions were not actually welcome regardless of whether they were invited. Madison raised her hand. She felt the room change. Not dramatically, just a slight collective tightening like a breath held. "Yes," Richard said. His voice was smooth. "The overtime policy revision," Madison said. "The one from yesterday's memo. I was hoping we could talk about the implementation timeline, specifically whether there's a transition period for employees who've been budgeting around the existing structure." The room was completely still. Richard looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that he kept off his face. "That's a decision that's already been finalized," he said. "I understand," Madison said. "I was asking about the timeline, not the decision itself." "The memo was clear," he said. "The memo gave an effective date," she said. "What I'm asking about is whether there's support available for workers who need time to adjust to the change in their pay structure." She wasn't yelling, she wasn't emotional. She was asking a specific, reasonable, answerable question in the same tone she would use to ask about a vendor contract. And Richard Whitmore, who was accustomed to silence greeting his decisions, who had sat at the head of this table for years with nobody pushing back, who had learned to read a room and knew that this one had always bent toward him. Richard Whitmore looked across that table at a 22-year-old on her 15th day of employment and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling in this room. He felt the room not bend, because the people around the table were looking at Madison, just for a moment, just briefly, in the way that people look at someone who has said the thing they have been thinking but did not believe it was safe to say. Gary's hands had moved. They were no longer flat on the table. He was sitting up slightly. Richard said, "This isn't the appropriate forum for that conversation." "Of course," Madison said. She sat back. "I'll follow up separately." He knew what that meant. They both did. The meeting ended 8 minutes later. People filed out with the particular speed of a group that had just witnessed something and needed to process it away from the room where it happened. Gary was the last to pass Madison's chair. He didn't say anything. He put his hand briefly on the back of her chair, not on her shoulder, not a touch, just a light contact on the furniture near her, and then he walked out. It was the smallest gesture. It meant everything. She went back to her desk. She called Janet at 9 minutes past 10. "The meeting just ended," she said. "I heard," Janet said. "Word travels fast up here." "Janet," Madison said quietly. "Daniel Hargrove, former board member. Do you know that name?" A pause that told her Janet absolutely knew that name. "Why?" Janet asked. "Because he has documentation," Madison said, "and I think he's willing to use it." The silence that followed was long and charged with something Madison could feel but not name. Then Janet said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "There are others, Madison. It wasn't just Hargrove. When the last board member left the one before Hargrove, she tried to open an investigation. Richard shut it down. She was gone within 3 months." Madison closed her eyes for a moment. "Her name," she said. "Do you have it?" "Sandra Okafor," Janet said. "She went back to legal. She's at a firm in Missoula now." Madison wrote it down. She spent the next 40 minutes working on an actual spreadsheet that was legitimately part of her job because she understood that whatever else was happening, she could not give Richard any professional ammunition. She documented everything she touched. She responded to every email within the hour. She was on the surface the most unremarkable new employee Blackridge had ever seen. And underneath that surface, she was building something. At 11:50, her phone buzzed. "Text from Cole Hargrove wants to meet. Tonight. Can you make it to Billings?" She typed back, "Yes." At 12:15, something happened that she did not expect. She was in the break room getting water when Donna, the receptionist, who had given her that brief, warm, loaded smile on her first date, came in and went directly to the coffee machine. They hadn't spoken much. Donna was not unfriendly, but she was careful in the way that long-term employees become careful in certain workplaces. She knew what was safe and kept herself inside it. But today, Donna poured her coffee, and then instead of leaving, she stood there for a moment, and then she turned to Madison and said, "My daughter's 24. Madison looked at her. "She just got her first real job," Donna said. Her voice was completely even. "I've been thinking about that this morning." Madison waited. "I've been here 11 years, Donna said. "And in 11 years I have watched—" She stopped, started again. "I have watched good people get cut down in this building for doing exactly what you did yesterday, for trying to do the right thing." "What happened to them?" Madison asked quietly. Donna looked at her directly. "Some of them left. Some of them stayed and got smaller." She paused. "I got smaller." The words landed heavy and honest. "You don't have to get smaller," Madison said. Donna held her coffee cup with both hands. "It's not that simple when you have bills to pay and you're 53 and the job market in this county is what it is." "I know," Madison said. "I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying if you ever wanted to talk to someone, officially, there might be a way to do it safely." Donna looked at her for a long time. "You've been here 15 days, she said. It wasn't a criticism. It was almost a question. "I know," Madison said. "And you're already doing this. Someone has to start." Donna looked down at her coffee. Something moved across her face that was old and tired, and also underneath that something that had been waiting. "Let me think," she said. "Take all the time you need," Madison said. Donna went back to her desk. Madison stood in the break room for a moment and thought about what had just happened, about Donna's daughter, who was 24, about 11 years of getting smaller, about the way Donna had said it like she was reporting a fact about someone else. Getting smaller. Like it was something that happened to you gradually from outside, until one day you looked and the person who had once been whole was a reduced version standing in a break room holding her coffee with both hands. She thought about Janet in 9 years. She thought about Gary in 19 years. She thought about the board member before Hargrove who had tried to start an investigation and was gone in 3 months. The pattern was the same every time. Richard found out someone was pushing and he applied pressure until they broke or left or got quiet. It had worked every time for a very long time. But this time was different. And the reason it was different was not Madison understood entirely because of her. The difference was that this time the person pushing had a father who owned one of Richard's largest suppliers and who had spent the previous night making calls to 7 people who had been waiting for a reason to talk. The difference was that this time, before Richard could apply his usual pressure, he was going to learn that the ground beneath him was already moving. She drove to Billings that evening after work. Cole was already there when she arrived at the restaurant, a quiet place mid-range, the kind of place where conversations didn't carry. He was sitting in a booth in the back with a man she'd never met but recognized from his photo in the Business Journal article Cole had found the night before. Daniel Hargrove was 66 years old. A compact man with reading glasses, he kept taking off and putting back on a habit Madison associated with people who were constantly deciding how much to say. He had the careful bearing of someone who had spent decades in corporate governance and who understood acutely the personal cost of what he was doing tonight. He shook Madison's hand and looked at her with the particular attention of someone taking measure. "Your father tells me you found the pricing error on your own," he said. "In my second week," she said. He nodded, sat back down. "And the overtime memo, you brought it to him directly." "The day it came out," she said. "I had a single page with projections. He didn't look at it." Hargrove glanced at Cole. Something passed between them. An adult recognition of something, a mutual understanding of what it meant that this young woman had walked into that office prepared and been dismissed without her preparation even being acknowledged. "I resigned from the Blackridge board 15 months ago," Hargrove said. He was looking at his coffee now. "I resigned because I couldn't stop what was happening, and I was being asked to sign off on things I couldn't sign off on." He paused. "I should have done more than resign. That's something I've had to sit with." Madison said nothing. She let him find his own way to it. "I have documentation," he said. "Board minutes that were altered, complaint records that were modified, correspondence between Richard and the previous HR director about how to handle reports in a way that," he exhaled, "in a way that protected him rather than the employees making the reports." The table was quiet. "That's enough for a real investigation," Cole said. "It's enough for more than that," Hargrove said. He looked at Madison. "But it needs the right people to hear it. Not just internally. The board that's there now, 3 of the 4 current members were appointed after I left. They're Richard's people. Any internal complaint goes to him first and stays there." "Then it doesn't go internal," Madison said. Both men looked at her. "If the internal structure is compromised," she said, "then you go external, labor board, legal counsel, reporters if it comes to that." She paused. "You said there was a settlement from a harassment complaint. Was there a NDA?" Hargrove nodded. "Sandra Okafor," Madison said. Hargrove went very still. "How do you know that name?" "Someone told me," Madison said. "Someone who's been watching for a long time and got smaller because she didn't think anyone was coming." Hargrove set his reading glasses down. He looked at her fully without the calculating measure of a moment ago. He looked at her the way you look at something that surprises you in a way you didn't expect. "Sandra's NDA covers her direct testimony," he said slowly. "It does not cover documentation that exists independently. It does not prevent other people from talking." "Then we need those other people," Madison said. "All of them." Cole was watching his daughter. He had ordered coffee and hadn't touched it. He was watching her the way he watched things when he was deciding something. "There's one more thing," Hargrove said. He reached into the bag beside him and pulled out a manila envelope, which he set on the table and did not open. "2 months before I resigned, a young man in the warehouse, his name is Marcus Webb, filed a formal safety complaint. OSHA-level concern, equipment failure that had caused 2 near misses in 6 months." He looked at the envelope. Richard had it rerouted through a compliance firm he has a private contract with. The complaint was reviewed, revised, and refiled in a form that made it look like the concern had been addressed. It hadn't been. Madison stared at the envelope. "Marcus Webb still works there," Hargrove said. "He's been there 6 years. He filed that complaint 2 years ago, and then got smaller," Madison said. Hargrove looked at her. "Yes. Is anyone going to get hurt?" she asked. "Is that equipment still a problem?" "I don't know," Hargrove said. "That's why I can't wait." Madison put both hands flat on the table. She thought about Gary and his jaw and his $300. She thought about Donna in 11 years and the daughter who was 24. She thought about Marcus Webb and a safety complaint that got rerouted into silence. She thought about 2 near misses that became 3 near misses in her mind, 4, 5 until someone stopped being lucky. She looked at her father. He was looking at her. Still, waiting. She understood in that moment what he was waiting for. He had come tonight because she needed him. He had made the calls and found Hargrove and driven to Billings and sat in this booth, but he was not going to tell her what to do next. He had never told her what to do. What he had always done her whole life was put her in the room with the information and then wait to see what she decided. She turned back to Hargrove. "I need you to tell me who else you've kept in contact with," she said. "Former employees, former board members, anyone who saw what was happening and didn't have a way to say it. And I need to know if any of them are willing to say it now." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the envelope. Inside was a list of names, 11 of them, with contact information beside each one, 11 people who had been waiting. The question was whether any of them were still willing to step forward, still willing to risk what they'd spent years protecting by staying quiet, whether the weight of what they knew could finally outpace the fear that had kept them silent. Madison looked at that list, and she started to understand that this was no longer just about what had happened to her on one Thursday afternoon. It was about all the Thursdays before it, all the moments in break rooms and parking lots and late-night drives home when someone had thought about speaking and then decided the cost was too high. She thought about the word place. She thought about who got to decide where a person's place was. And quietly, with both hands still flat on the table, and her father sitting across from her saying nothing, because he didn't need to say anything anymore, Madison Carter decided that she was going to find out. The list had 11 names on it. Madison sat with it that night at her kitchen table after she got back from Billings, the paper in front of her, a pen in her hand, and she went through each name the way she went through every problem methodically without flinching one at a time. Some of them she recognized. Gary had mentioned two of the names in passing during conversations she'd filed away, without knowing why she was filing them. Janet had alluded to a third without using the name directly the way people refer to painful things by talking around them. The others were strangers, but strangers whose phone numbers were written beside their names in Hargrove's careful handwriting, which meant they had agreed at some point to be found. That mattered. You don't give someone your contact information unless some part of you is hoping they'll use it. She called the first person on the list at 8 the next morning. His name was Ray Dutton, and he had worked in Black Ridge's logistics department for 6 years before leaving abruptly 18 months ago. He picked up on the fourth ring, and when she told him who she was and how she'd gotten his number, there was a silence that lasted long enough that she thought he might hang up. I didn't. How old are you? He asked. 22, she said, another pause. And you've been there how long? 17 days. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. And you're already in the middle of this. I didn't plan it that way, she said. Nobody does, Ray said. There was something in his voice, not bitterness exactly, but the residue of it, the way a feeling leaves a texture behind even after it fades. What do you want to know? Everything, she said, but specifically, when you left, was it your choice? The silence this time was a different kind, heavier. That depends on how you define choice, Ray said finally. He didn't fire me, he just made it. He stopped, started again. You know when a place makes you feel like you're disappearing? Like every week there's a little less of you than there was the week before. He paused. That's what it was. I left because I could still recognize myself in the mirror, and I was afraid that if I waited much longer, I wouldn't be able to. Madison wrote that down, not as a quote, not as evidence, just as a human truth that she needed to hold on to. Ray, she said, would you be willing to talk to someone official, a labor attorney maybe, or a labor board investigator? The pause that followed was the longest yet. Who else is talking? He asked. I can't tell you names yet, she said, but you're not first and you won't be last. Another silence. She waited. She had learned in 2.5 weeks at Blackridge that the most important thing you could do when someone was deciding whether to trust you was to give them the space to decide. Let me think about it, Ray said. Take your time, she said. But Ray, there's a safety issue. Equipment in the warehouse. If that's still unresolved, someone could get hurt. That changes the timeline. I went quiet in a way that was different from the other silences. This one was sharp. Marcus told you, he said. No, she said, but you just did. Ray breathed it out. I knew about the near misses, he said. I filed my own report about it before I left. I don't know what happened to it. It got rerouted, Madison said, same as Marcus's, same system. God, Ray said, not as an exclamation, as a wait. I'll call you again in 2 days, Madison said. That gives you time. But Ray, I need you to know that whatever you decide, you were heard. By me. Right now. That part already happened. She didn't know exactly why she said that last part. It came from somewhere instinctual, some understanding of what it cost a person to have spent 18 months carrying something that nobody official had ever acknowledged. She heard him exhale. 2 days, he said. She called 4 more people that morning before she drove to work. 2 of them didn't answer. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who had been Richard's executive assistant 3 years ago, answered immediately, like she'd been waiting by the phone, and spoke for 45 minutes in a voice that grew steadier the longer she talked, the way a person's voice does when they have been storing words for a long time and the act of releasing them is physically relieving. Patricia described a pattern of behavior that went beyond intimidation and into something more calculated, deliberate professional isolation of employees who raised concerns, strategic use of performance reviews to build paper trails against people. Richard had already decided to push out. In a private communication channel, he used to coordinate with his preferred HR contacts in ways that bypassed the company's official complaint process. He's been doing this for at least 8 years, Patricia said. Possibly longer. It got worse. It used to be he'd just make people miserable until they left. The last 3 years, he got strategic about it, like he'd gotten better at it. Madison wrote everything down. She verified what she could against the public record and the documents Hargrove had provided. She was building piece by piece, not just a complaint, but a picture, a comprehensive, documented, corroborated picture of a man who had turned a company into his personal instrument of control and had done it so gradually and so completely that the people inside it had stopped being able to see the shape of what surrounded them. She got to work 20 minutes late. It was the first time she'd been late, Richard noticed. She saw it in the slight pause when he passed her desk, a pause he didn't acknowledge verbally, but which was itself a message. She was being watched now. She had known that since the meeting with Cole in the lobby. But the watching had shifted from general suspicion to something more specific, more deliberate. She kept working. She was meticulous. She documented everything. At 10:45, Trevor appeared at her desk again. His face was still carefully neutral, but there was something new behind it, a kind of controlled urgency, like a man walking quickly without letting himself run. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you," he said. "Now." She saved what she was working on. She picked up her notepad. She stood up. And that was when Gary appeared from the direction of the warehouse corridor. He didn't stop walking. He was heading somewhere. The copy room may be somewhere with a legitimate reason to pass, but as he went by Madison's desk, he said, without turning his head, without stopping barely above the volume of the ambient office, "You're not alone in there." She heard it. She didn't react. She followed Trevor to the elevator. Richard's office felt smaller than it had the first time she'd been in it. She didn't know if that was because of what she now knew or because she herself was different. But something about the room had lost its ability to compress her the way it had on that first Thursday when she'd stood in it with her single page of projections and felt the weight of being dismissed. She sat down. Richard was standing. He stayed standing, another calibration, another small exercise of spatial authority. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "I know what your father is doing. I know he made calls. I know he spoke with Daniel Hargrove." He said Hargrove's name with the particular flatness of a man saying the name of someone he considers a traitor. "I want you to understand that whatever your father thinks he's building, it's not going to go where he thinks it is. Hargrove has an axe to grind. He left under difficult circumstances and has been looking for a way to—" "What were the circumstances?" Madison asked. Richard stopped. "Of his departure," she said calmly. "You said difficult circumstances. What were they of him?" He looked at her. "That's not relevant to this conversation." "I think it is," she said, "because you're characterizing his motivations without being willing to describe the situation that created them. That's asking me to accept a conclusion without the evidence." "I'm not here to debate evidence with you," he said, and something in his voice had changed, a tightening barely perceptible. "I'm here to tell you that you're making decisions you don't understand the consequences of." "I understand them," she said. "You're 22 years old." "You keep saying that," she said. "I think you're hoping it'll land differently than it has." The room went completely still. Richard looked at her with something that was no longer smoothly controlled. The surface was intact, the suit, the posture, the measured expression, but underneath it something had been disturbed. She could see it the way you can see movement below the surface of water. "You want to know what I think?" he said. He moved around the desk, not toward her, just around it, a restless movement. "I think a 22-year-old girl who's been here 3 weeks decided to make herself into a story. I think your father came in here with his vest and his people and thought that was going to intimidate me. And I think you've gotten yourself caught up in something that's going to end your career in this industry before it starts." Madison said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you actually believe that, or are you saying it because it's always worked before?" He turned and looked at her sharply. Because I've read about the people who tried to push back before me, she said, and I've noticed that you always say a version of the same thing, that they have an axe to grind, that they don't understand the consequences, that they're making themselves into a story. She paused. But you know what? I haven't found anywhere in the record a single instance where you actually engaged with what they were saying. Not one time where you said, here's why the complaint is wrong. Here's why the safety report was incorrect. Here's why the documentation doesn't mean what they say it means. She kept her voice completely even. Because you can't say that, can you? You can only discredit the person. You can never address the substance. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. Richard's jaw was working. He was controlling something with visible effort, which was itself new. She had not seen him have to control anything before. He had always been the one applying pressure, never the one containing it. I want to be clear, he said, and his voice had dropped and gone cold, in the way that things go cold when they're no longer just warm or cool, but genuinely dangerously cold. If you continue this, if you continue speaking to former employees, if your father continues involving himself in company business, I will end your employment here. I will make sure every contact I have in this industry knows why. You will not get a reference. You will not. That would be retaliation, she said, against a protected whistleblower activity, and it would be the single most useful thing you could do for the case that's already being built against you. The word case hit the room like a stone hitting water. Richard went still. What case, he said. It wasn't a question. It was barely even words. It was the sound of a man's certainty developing a crack. I don't know all the details yet, Madison said honestly, but Daniel Hargrove has documentation of altered board minutes and modified complaint records. A former employee has 2 independent safety reports that were rerouted and buried. A former executive assistant has 8 years of observed conduct that fits a consistent pattern. She paused. And there are others. I can't tell you how many right now because I'm still making calls. Richard sat down. It happened so quickly and so involuntarily that she thought for a moment he hadn't meant to do it. He sat down in his chair behind his desk and he looked at her, and for one unguarded second she saw it. The thing underneath the suit and the smooth voice and the open door that was never actually open. Fear, not a lot of it, not enough to break him, not yet, but enough to be visible for just that 1 second before the surface closed back over it. You're going to want to speak to legal counsel, Madison said. She stood up. I think that's in everyone's interest. She picked up her notepad and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him say, this won't go the way you think. She stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. I know, she said. It's going to go better. She walked out. Her hands were shaking by the time she got to the elevator. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the particular physical aftermath of standing in a room with a man who was threatening her and holding her ground anyway. She pressed the elevator button and breathed in slowly through her nose, the way her father had taught her when she was 14 and overwhelmed and couldn't figure out how to make the feeling stop. Slow breath in, hold it, slow breath out. Again. The elevator came. She got in. By the time the doors opened on her floor, her hands were steady. She sat down at her desk and sent a text to Cole. He knows. He threatened retaliation. I told him about the case. Cole's response came in 40 seconds. Good. Hargrove's attorney is filing a formal complaint with the Montana Labor Board this afternoon. Timing was right. She stared at that for a moment. Then she typed, you knew this morning. Cole, I knew last night. Didn't want to tell you before the meeting. Wanted you going in there on your own terms, not carrying mine. She held the phone for a moment. She thought about what that meant, her father arranging something significant, deliberately not telling her, so that what she said to Richard would be entirely her own. So that if it landed with authority, it would be her authority, not borrowed from him. She typed, thank you. He sent back, you didn't need my words in that room. You proved it. She put the phone face down and went back to work. The labor board complaint landed publicly at 3:47 that afternoon. She knew the moment it happened because the quality of the building changed. Not loudly, Backridge Outdoor Industries did not become a loud place at 3:47. It became very quiet, the specific electric quiet of an office where information is moving and everyone is pretending they don't know it yet. Trevor's face when she glanced up from her computer was doing something complicated. He was staring at his screen. His jaw was tight. His hands were typing something, but she didn't think he was thinking about what he was typing. Gary appeared in the corridor between the warehouse and the main floor, which was not unusual, but the way he appeared was he was moving with a particular purposefulness. And when he caught Madison's eye across the room, he gave one small, slow nod. He had seen it. He knew. The afternoon passed in that charged, humming quiet. Richard did not come out of his office. His door, for the first time in Madison's experience of the building, was fully closed. At 4:15, Janet called Madison's desk line. "3 people from the warehouse just came to talk to me," Janet said, and her voice was different. It had lost the upward inflection, the apologetic tilt. She sounded like herself, Madison thought, or like the self she'd been before 9 years of small surrenders had taught her to make herself smaller. "They heard about the labor board complaint. They want to know what they can do." "Tell them to write down everything they remember," Madison said. "Dates, incidents, conversations, everything. Don't share it with anyone internal yet. Just document it." "Okay," Janet said. "Then Madison, there's something I didn't tell you before. About the safety issue, Marcus Webb's complaint, I saw it. The original version before it got rerouted. I was CC'd on it by accident, and then the copy disappeared from my email, but I saw it." She paused. "I remember what it said." Madison's grip on the phone tightened. "Can you write down what you remember?" "I already started," Janet said. Madison closed her eyes for a second. "Janet," she said, "you're brave." "I'm terrified," Janet said. "Those aren't opposites," Madison said. A brief pause. Then Janet said quietly, "No, I suppose they're not." The call ended and Madison sat for a moment in the particular silence of someone who is watching something they built begin to stand up and move on its own. She had started making calls 2 mornings ago. She had 11 names on a list. She had reached 5 of them, and now 3 warehouse workers she'd never spoken to were in Janet's office writing things down. And Donna was thinking, and Gary had nodded across a room, and Ray Dutton was spending 2 days deciding, and somewhere in Missoula, a woman named Sandra Okafor was either already aware of what was happening or was about to find out. She thought about what Hargrove had said at the restaurant. "I should have done more than resign. That's something I've had to sit with." She thought about what it cost a person to sit with something for 15 months. She picked up the phone and called the 6th name on the list. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 31 years old and had worked in the Black Ridge warehouse for 6 years and had filed a safety complaint 2 years ago and watched it disappear and had kept showing up every morning since because he had 2 kids and a mortgage and because disappearing in the slow way that people disappear in places like Black Ridge was survivable and he wasn't sure that losing the job was. He picked up on the first ring. "I heard," he said. He knew who she was before she said a word. "Word travels," she said. "In this town, yeah." He paused. "The labor board complaint, is that real? Or is it the kind of thing that gets filed and then buried?" "It's real," she said. "Hargrove's attorney filed it. There's documentation attached. It's not a general grievance, it's specific, it's sourced, and it names the modified records directly." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Will they do anything with it?" "They'll have to," she said, "especially if there are additional voices. The safety issue changes the calculation, and unresolved OSHA-level concern that's been papered over isn't just a labor dispute. It's liability. It's a different kind of serious." She heard him breathe, in, out. "My kids are 9 and 7, he said. "I know," she said, though she hadn't known the ages. But she understood what he was saying. "If this goes wrong, Marcus," she said, "I can't promise you it won't be hard. I can't promise the timeline is short or that there's no risk. I won't do that to you." She paused. "What I can tell you is that your report, the original one, before it was rerouted, there's someone who saw it, someone who remembers what it said. You aren't the only person who knows it existed." A long silence. "Who?" he asked. She thought about whether to say. She decided he'd earned it. "Janet," she said. Another silence, different from the others, warmer. "Janet," he repeated. "She always—" He stopped. "She used to check in on us in the warehouse. After the second near miss. She'd come down and just ask if we were okay." "She didn't have to do that." "No," Madison said. "She didn't. She saw the report. She remembers it," Madison said. "She's writing it down." Marcus was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Madison began to think she'd pushed too far, asked for too much, moved too fast. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She exhaled without letting him hear it. "Your testimony," she said. "The whole thing. What you reported, what you were told, what happened after. In your own words, as specific as you can make it. She paused. And Marcus, is the equipment still a problem? Right now, today, is there an active safety risk? He answered without hesitating. Yes. One word, flat and certain and impossible to misread. Then we need to move quickly, she said. I'll start tonight, he said. How do I get it to you? My personal email, she said, and gave it to him. Not the company one. Yeah, he said, I figured. Bun hung up, and Madison sat for a moment with the weight of what he'd just said. Yes, the equipment is still a problem right now today, and she understood that whatever timeline she'd been imagining, it was shorter than she thought. She called Cole. He picked up on the second ring. The safety issue is active, she said. Marcus Webb confirmed it. The equipment hasn't been fixed. Cole was quiet for exactly the length of time it took to absorb that. Hargrove's attorney needs to know, he said. Tonight. That elevates it from a labor complaint to a potential OSHA violation. That's federal. I know, she said. I'll call him, Cole said. You call. I'm calling Sandra Okafor, Madison said. A pause. She's under NDA, Cole said. The NDA covers her direct testimony, Madison said. It doesn't cover what Hargrove documented independently. It doesn't cover what Marcus and Ray and Patricia and Janet are willing to say. What it does cover is her silence, and there's a difference between legally required silence and strategic silence. She paused. I want her to know what's happening. I want her to know she's not alone in this anymore. Even if she can't speak, she deserves to know. Cole was quiet for a moment. You're not wrong, he said. She found the number through the law firm's public directory. Sandra Okafor's name was listed as senior associate. She called the main number and asked for her. Sandra answered her own line. Her voice was professional and measured the voice of a woman who had learned to present a smooth surface over complicated terrain. Ms. Okafor, Madison said. My name is Madison Carter. I work at Black Ridge Outdoor Industries. I was told your name by someone who respects what you tried to do when you were on the board. Silence. I'm not asking you to violate your agreement, Madison said quickly. I wanted you to know that a formal labor complaint was filed today. That there are multiple people speaking now, that the safety issue in the warehouse has been confirmed as ongoing. She paused. And I wanted to say that what you tried to do, the investigation you tried to open, it mattered. Even though it didn't work, it mattered because it was the right thing and it was real. The silence on Sandra Okafor's end lasted a long time. When she spoke, her voice was not the professional, measured voice she'd answered with. It was a different voice, quieter. Older sounding in the way that certain emotions age a voice. How many people are involved, she asked. Growing, what Madison said. I don't have a final number. Another pause. The safety issue, Sandra said carefully, is there documentation? 2 independent reports, Madison said. Both originally filed internally, both rerouted. One witness who saw the original filing, and a current employee who is willing to testify about the ongoing condition. She heard Sandra breathing. Ms. Carter, Sandra said slowly, my agreement has specific language, but it does not. She stopped, started again, very carefully. There are things that are not mine to say, but there are also things that are not mine to prevent others from finding. She paused. I would suggest that Hargrove's attorney look carefully at the Montana whistleblower statute, specifically the provision regarding imminent physical harm. Madison wrote that down, underlined it. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Sandra said. I should have. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled, but only just. Good luck, Ms. Carter. The call ended, and Madison sat in the quiet of her office, with the pen still in her hand and the notepad in front of her, and a long column of things she'd written down over the last 48 hours. And she understood that what had started as one conversation between a young woman and a man who told her to remember her place had become something that Richard Whitmore could no longer manage alone. He was going to need lawyers. He was going to need spin. I was going to need all the tools he'd used before, the pressure and the characterization and the strategic positioning in the private channels. But the problem this time was that every tool he reached for was going to find something in the way, because they weren't quiet anymore. At 5:30, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Madison Carter, a man's voice, businesslike. Yes. My name is Thomas Reed. I'm a reporter with the Montana Standard. I've been made aware of a labor board complaint filed today regarding Black Ridge Outdoor Industries. I'm reaching out to the company for comment and also to," he paused. "I was given your name as someone who might have a direct perspective." Madison's pulse spiked. "Who gave you my name?" she asked. A brief pause. "I'm not able to share that." She thought about the list of 11 people. She thought about Ray Dutton's laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. She thought about Patricia speaking for 45 minutes with a voice that grew steadier as she released what she'd been carrying. "I'm not prepared to comment publicly yet," she said carefully, "but I'd like to stay in contact if that's okay." "Of course," Thomas Reed said. "Here's my number." She wrote it down. She hung up and looked at the notepad. Then she thought about Richard's closed door, the first time in 17 days it had been closed. She thought about what that door meant: open control surveillance, the performance of accessibility that was actually the performance of authority. And she thought about what it meant closed. It meant he was in there alone. For the first time in a very long time, Richard Whitmore was on the inside of something instead of the outside, and the thing he was inside of was getting smaller. She picked up her bag. She shut down her computer. She stopped at Janet's office on the way to the elevator. Janet was still there. It was past 5:30, and Janet was still there at her desk writing. "Go home," Madison said. "Get some rest." Janet looked up. Her face was different, not unguarded exactly, but less defended than Madison had ever seen it. Like something she'd been holding for a long time had shifted its position. "I'm almost done," Janet said. "The documents will keep," Madison said. "You need to be okay tomorrow." Janet looked at her for a moment. "Are you?" she asked. "Okay," Madison considered that honestly. "I think so," she said. "Yeah, I think I actually am." So Janet nodded. She capped her pen. She looked at the pages in front of her, the careful, detailed pages of 9 years of memory, finally given shape. And she said quietly, almost to herself, "I should have done this a long time ago." "You're doing it now," Madison said. "That's the part that matters." She left Janet to finish. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button and waited. Behind her down the hall, Richard's door was still closed. She looked at it for a moment. Then the elevator came and she got in, and the doors closed, and she rode down 17 floors to the lobby and walked out into the evening. And the air outside was cold and clean and smelled like Montana in the fall. The particular sharp, real smell of a place that doesn't care what you're carrying, that just is and keeps being regardless. She drove home. On the way, her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. She didn't look at it until she parked. It was from a number she didn't have saved, a 406 area code, a short message. "This is Ray Dutton. I'm in. Tell me what you need." She read it twice. Then she put the phone down and sat in the dark for a moment, alone in her car, in her parking lot, and for the first time since the Thursday that started all of this, she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. Not the fear of it, not the strategy of it, but the human weight of it. The fact that real people with real lives and real losses were trusting her with something that had cost them years. She was 22 years old. She had been at Black Ridge Outdoor Industries for 18 days. And somewhere in a closed office 17 floors above ground, a man who had spent years deciding where people belonged was about to find out that the only person who got to decide that was the person standing in front of you. She picked up the phone and typed back to Ray, "Thank you. I'll call you in the morning. Get some sleep." Then she got out of the car and went inside, and she made herself eat something, and she set her alarm for 6, and she lay in the dark for a while thinking about Sandra Okafor's careful voice and the specific provision of the Montana whistleblower statute in the 2 near misses that had become a silent ongoing danger, and the 9-year-old and 7-year-old who were the reason Marcus Webb had kept showing up every morning. And she thought about her father, who had once told her never start a fight, but never let someone take your dignity without knowing there's a cost. She had not started this fight, but she was going to finish it. Ray Dutton called at 7 the next morning before Madison had finished her first cup of coffee. She picked up immediately. "I didn't sleep," he said. Not as a complaint, just as a fact, the way people state facts when they've made a decision that kept them awake and they're no longer apologizing for it. "Neither did I," she said. "I've been writing," he said, "since about 2 in the morning. I have 14 pages. Madison set down her cup. 14 pages. 6 years is a long time, he said. "Once I started, I couldn't stop. It's like, when you've been carrying something so long that it starts to feel like it's just part of you, And then someone gives you permission to put it down and you realize how heavy it actually was. He paused. It's like that. She understood exactly what he meant. She'd heard it in Patricia's voice. She'd heard it in the way Donna had said, I got smaller, like the admission itself was a form of relief. Ray, she said, send me what you have, and then I need you to be willing to speak to an attorney. Already looked one up last night, he said. There's a labor rights firm in Helena. I called their after-hours line at 3 in the morning like a crazy person and left a message. She almost smiled. Good. Madison. His voice shifted. The equipment Marcus reported I was there for one of the near misses. The second one, I saw it happen. He paused. A man almost lost 3 fingers. They sent him home early and told him not to talk about it. The words landed like a fist. His name, she asked. Pete Callahan, Ray said. He's still there, still working the same line. She wrote it down. I'm going to need to talk to him. He won't be easy, Ray said. He's got a family. He needed the job. After it happened, he put his head down and kept going. He convinced himself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't, she said. No, Ray said. It wasn't. She got to work by 8:15. She went directly to the warehouse floor, which was technically outside her department's normal territory, but not so unusual that it would immediately register as significant. She found Marcus Webb at his station, a man built wide and solid with the hands of someone who had been doing physical work since before he was old enough to choose it. He saw her coming and gave her a look that was simultaneously relieved and scared, she was learning, the exact expression that courage wore most of the time. Pete Callahan, she said quietly, stopping beside him, as though reviewing something on her clipboard. Where is he? Marcus didn't look up from what he was doing. Line 3, far end. Can he talk? During break, Marcus said. 20 minutes. He always goes to his truck. Which one? Blue Silverado. Tailgate's got a dent on the left side. She nodded. She kept moving like she'd been headed somewhere else all along. 23 minutes later, she was standing beside a blue Silverado with a dented tailgate and a man sitting inside it eating a sandwich, with the methodical focus of someone who uses lunch breaks to remember what normal feels like. She knocked on the window. Pete Callahan was 54 years old with a thick gray mustache and eyes that had the particular quality of a person who had learned to read situations before committing to a reaction. He rolled down the window and looked at her without expression. You're the new one, he said, management track. Yes, she said, my name's Madison. I know who you are, he said. Word gets around in a warehouse. He took another bite of his sandwich. What do you want? Ray Dutton told me about the near miss, she said. The second one. He said you were there. Pete's jaw stopped moving for a moment. Then he finished chewing and swallowed and looked straight ahead through the windshield. Ray's talking, he said. It wasn't a question. Ray's talking, she confirmed. Hargrove filed a complaint, Pete said, still looking straight ahead. Saw it on my phone this morning. Yes. So this is real, he said. This isn't just somebody making noise. It's real, she said. Pete, you almost lost your fingers. Marcus reported it, and the report got buried. If there's an active safety risk on that line right now, and it's documented that the company knew and did nothing. I know what it means, he said sharply. He turned to look at her then. His eyes were harder than his voice. I know exactly what it means. I've known what it means for 2 years. You think I didn't know? He stopped himself, breathed. I got a daughter in college. I got a son in 8th grade. I got a mortgage and a truck payment, and my wife works part-time because one of us has to be home when the kids get back. He paused. What was I supposed to do? File a report and lose the job, and then what? Then what, Madison? She didn't try to answer that. She let it land, all of it. I know, she said. I know exactly what it cost you to stay quiet, and I know it wasn't weakness. It was survival. She paused. But Pete, someone is going to get hurt. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but the risk is still there, and it's been there for 2 years, and if someone gets seriously injured on that line after everything that's been documented, I know, he said. Quiet now. The anger folded back into something heavier. I think about it. I think about it a lot. He looked at his sandwich like he'd forgotten it was there. I think about the kid they hired last spring, 23 years old. He works that line. The silence between them was the kind that carries more meaning than words. What do you need? Pete said finally. Your statement, she said. What you saw. What happened to you? What you were told afterward? I was quiet for a long moment. Will it actually help? Or is this the kind of thing where everybody talks and then Richard does what Richard does, and in 3 months we're all just gone and the line is still there and the kid is still working it? It was the most important question anyone had asked her in the last 3 days, and it deserved an honest answer. I can't guarantee the outcome, she said. I can tell you that the labor board complaint is filed and it's not going away. I can tell you that the safety issue specifically triggers a federal dimension that changes the legal pressure. I can tell you that there are more people talking than Richard knows about. She paused. And I can tell you that if you don't say something and someone gets hurt, you'll carry that. Same as you've been carrying the last 2 years, but heavier. Pete looked at her for a long time. The kind of look that is really a person looking at themselves using another person's face as the mirror. Then he said, "Give me until end of shift." "I'll be in the parking lot," she said. She walked back inside. At 11:47, Richard Whitmore called an all-staff meeting. It was announced via a company-wide email that went out at 11:39, which gave people exactly 8 minutes to stop what they were doing and find their way to the main conference room on the second floor. 8 minutes was not an accident. 8 minutes was a message. This is happening on my timeline, not yours. I still control the clock. Madison was already at her desk when the email arrived. She read it once. Then she sent a quick text to Cole all-staff meeting, 11:47, and went upstairs. The room was fuller than she'd ever seen it. Every chair was taken and people were standing along the walls. She found a spot near the back, near the door, which she chose deliberately. Standing near the door of a room where you're not sure what's coming is not cowardice. It's information. You need to see how people move, where the energy goes, who looks at whom. Richard came in at exactly 11:47. He was flanked by two people Madison hadn't seen before, a man in a dark suit who carried a legal notepad, and a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, who Madison immediately identified as HR by the particular combination of professional warmth and careful detachment that HR directors learn to wear in situations like this. Outside HR, not the internal department, outside counsel. He'd move fast. He stood at the front of the room and looked out at the assembled employees with an expression he'd clearly worked on. It was designed to project calm authority, the kind of leadership presence that says, "I see this situation clearly and I am managing it." It was a performance Madison would have found more convincing if she hadn't spent the last several days learning everything she now knew about the man delivering it. "I know there's been some concern," Richard began, "following an external complaint that was filed yesterday about our company. I want to address that directly and transparently." Directly and transparently, she filed that. The complaint was filed by a former board member who left this company under contentious circumstances and has been seeking an avenue which to relitigate a personal dispute ever since. "We take all formal complaints seriously and we are cooperating fully with the appropriate processes." He paused. "What I want to assure every person in this room is that Black Ridge Outdoor Industries has always operated with integrity, with care for our employees, and with a commitment to doing things the right way." He kept going. He talked for 6 minutes. He used phrases like baseless allegations and politically motivated and commitment to our people. He was good at it, genuinely good, with the fluency of someone who had given versions of this speech before in smaller contexts and had always found that it worked. Madison watched the room while he talked. She watched Gary, who was standing near the far wall with his arms crossed and his jaw in the same tight configuration she'd seen on the day she arrived. She watched Trevor, who was sitting in the second row and whose face had gone completely neutral, in the deliberate way that people go neutral when they are actively feeling something they don't want to show. She watched Donna near the middle of the room, who was looking at the table in front of her. And she watched the younger employees, the ones in their 20s and early 30s, hired in the last 2 years, who didn't have the layered institutional history that Gary and Janet and Donna and Pete carried. They were watching Richard with expressions that were uncertain, not yet calcified into the performed neutrality of people who had learned to read him. They were still deciding. When Richard finished, he asked if there were questions. The standard 3 seconds of silence. And then Gary spoke. It was so unexpected, not because Gary was timid, but because in 19 years, Gary had apparently never spoken in a meeting like this. And everyone in the room seemed to understand that this was different, that the specific silence before Gary's voice had a different quality than the standard buffer silence that the room went to a new kind of still. The overtime memo, Gary said. His voice was completely level. The policy change, was that decision reviewed with any input from the people it affects? Richard looked at Gary, a long look, the look of a man cataloging something. Compensation policy decisions are made at the executive level, Richard said. I understand that, Gary said. I'm asking whether any input was sought from the employees themselves. That's not the process, Richard said. I know it's not the current process, Gary said. I'm asking whether it should be. The room was so quiet that Madison could hear the HVAC system cycling. Richard's expression did not change. Gary, you've been with this company a long time. You understand how decisions are made here. I do, Gary said. That's why I'm asking. It was not an accusation. It was not aggressive. It was a man who had been at a company for 19 years, who had been passed over for a promotion in favor of someone who played golf with the right person who had watched the overtime memo land on his warehouse floor and seen what it did to the faces of his team. It was that man finally in front of witnesses asking a clear and specific question and declining to accept a non-answer. The room shifted. Subtly but completely the way a tide shifts, not in a single dramatic wave, but in the collective movement of something that has quietly decided to go a different direction. Richard ended the meeting 2 minutes later. People filed out in a silence that felt nothing like the silence that usually followed his meetings. Usually people dispersed with the specific pressurized relief of a room where tension has been held in check and can finally be released. This silence was different. This was the silence of people who were thinking. Madison was nearly out the door when Richard said, "Madison, stay please." She stopped. She turned. The room emptied. The HR director and the legal counsel stayed. Richard waited until the last person was out and then looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the cold dismissal of their first meeting, not the controlled threat of their last conversation. Something more calculating than either of those. Something that had been rearranged by 48 hours of information arriving from directions he hadn't anticipated. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand," she said. The HR director's eyes moved slightly. The legal counsel wrote something on his notepad. "I want to make you an offer," Richard said. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I think there was a miscommunication about the overtime policy and how it was communicated, and I'm willing to revisit that." He paused. "I'm also willing to discuss a formal role for you on the operations team, a real role with appropriate compensation." "In exchange for," "No," she said. He stopped. "I'm not going to stop talking to people," she said. "I'm not going to ask Ray or Patricia or Marcus to stop. And I'm not going to pretend that a better job title addresses the things that actually need to be addressed." She kept her voice even, completely even. "If you want to revisit the overtime policy because it's the right thing for the employees, do that. Don't do it as a negotiating chip. You're not in a position to," he started. "Richard." The HR director spoke. Her name, Madison would later learn, was Carol Marsh, and she had been brought in from a firm in Denver, and she had been in this work long enough to recognize a situation that had stopped being manageable and needed to be handled differently. "Perhaps we should—" "Let me finish," Richard said, and the sharpness in his voice when he said it to Carol was naked and sudden, stripped of the performance he'd been maintaining. And Carol Marsh saw it, and Madison saw it, and the legal counsel saw it, and the room held it. Carol Marsh looked at Richard for a moment. Then she looked at Madison. "Mr. Carter," Carol said in a voice that had recalibrated entirely, "would you be willing to make yourself available to speak with me separately, informally?" Madison looked at her. Carol Marsh's face was the face of a professional doing a calculation, but it was also underneath that the face of a woman who had just seen something in this room that she was going to have to factor into her own position. "Yes," Madison said, "I'd be willing to do that." She left. In the elevator going down, she sent Cole a text that said, "They offered me a deal. I said no. The HR director wants to talk separately." Cole's response, "The HR director is there. She protects them." She typed back, "She's starting to see the problem with that." No response for a moment. "Then be careful." She sent back, "Always." The afternoon moved fast and in ways she hadn't predicted, which was how the afternoon was always going to move once things were in motion unpredictably at the speed of other people's decisions. At 1:15, Pete Callahan sent her a text that said simply, "I wrote it down, 6 pages. What do I do with it?" She called Hargrove's attorney directly. A woman named Diane Foss, who had been in labor law for 22 years and who spoke with the measured precision of someone who had learned that words were instruments and that careless instruments cause damage. Madison explained Pete's situation, the near miss, the original complaint, the ongoing risk. Diane Foss was quiet for 4 seconds. "Get me his statement today," she said, "and get me a description of the specific equipment and its location. I'm filing an OSHA referral this afternoon. That's a federal notification. Once that's filed, the company is legally required to respond." "How quickly?" Madison asked. "The statute requires a response within 15 days, Diane said. "But with an active risk, they can issue an immediate investigation order." She paused. "Ms. Carter, has this young man, Pete Callahan, has he spoken to anyone internally about the ongoing condition?" "No," Madison said. "He's been quiet." "Goodbye," Diane said. "Tell him not to say anything internally until I've spoken with him directly. Can you get him to call me?" "I'll have him call you in the next hour." She texted Pete. He called Diane Foss at 2:10. At 2:45, Thomas Reed from the Montana Standard called her again. "I've confirmed the labor board complaint," he said. "I've confirmed the filing. I'm working on a story. I want to give the company an opportunity to respond, and I want to give you an opportunity to be part of the record." He paused. "Off the record first, is there a safety component to this?" She thought about what Diane Foss had said, about the OSHA referral, about what became public and when. "I can tell you that there is a federal referral in process," she said carefully. "I'm not going to characterize it beyond that, but the people who should be on the record are the people who experienced it directly." "Can you connect me?" he asked. She thought about Marcus, about Pete, about Ray with his 14 pages and his 3 a.m. phone call to a labor attorney. "Let me ask them," she said. "They get to decide that themselves." "Fair," he said. "One more thing off the record. How does a 22-year-old with 3 weeks at a company end up at the center of something like this?" She thought about Thursday. She thought about Remember Your Place. She thought about Gary's hands flat on the table, and Janet's upward inflection, and 11 years and 9 years, and the daughter who was 24. She asked a question and didn't accept a non-answer, Madison said. That's all it was. Thomas Reed was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll be in touch." At 4 o'clock, Carol Marsh found Madison at her desk. She sat down in the chair beside it, not across from it, beside it, which was a choice, and Madison registered it as a choice. Carol was in her mid-50s, capable-looking, with the particular composure of someone who had spent decades walking into difficult rooms. "I want to be straightforward with you," Carol said quietly. "Please," Madison said. "I was brought in to help the company manage this situation," Carol said. "That's my job. But my job also requires me to assess the actual situation, not the version of it I'm presented with." She paused. "I've spent the last 3 hours reading." She didn't say reading what. She didn't need to. "There are things here that go beyond what I was told before I arrived." Madison waited. "The safety issue," Carol said. "I need to know if there's an active risk on the warehouse floor." Madison looked at her. "An OSHA referral was filed this afternoon," she said. Carol closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something in her face had changed. The professional composure was still there, but it had been reorganized around something more fundamental, around the recognition of what it meant that a federal safety referral had been filed about an active work site. "Richard doesn't know yet," Madison said. "No," Carol said. "He doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Carter, I want to be clear that I represent the company, not any individual within it. That distinction is about to matter." Madison understood what that meant. It meant Carol Marsh had just moved the line. "There's going to be a board meeting," Carol said. "Emergency session. I've already recommended it." She stood. "I can't tell you what will happen, but I can tell you that what you've done, the people you've given away to speak, that's going to be in that room." She left. Madison sat at her desk and breathed for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her father. He picked up on the second ring. "Carol Marsh just told me there's an emergency board session," she said. She moved away from Richard. "I know," Cole said. She paused. "How do you know?" "Because Daniel Hargrove is on the phone with 2 of the current board members right now," Cole said. "Has been for the last 40 minutes. The documentation he has, the altered minutes, the modified complaints, those are the kind of things that make board members very aware of their own personal liability." Of course, she should have seen that. The board members didn't just have a moral exposure, they had a legal one. If they had signed off on reports they should have known were altered, if they had allowed a safety issue to be papered over, and it resulted in injury. They were not just witnesses to Richard's conduct. They were potentially implicated by it. Richard had spent years making people feel like they were alone in their exposure. He had never considered that the exposure might eventually reach the people he thought were protected. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Is this going to work?" Cole was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet, the real quiet. "Madison," he said, "it's already working. The question is just how far it goes." She looked at the building around her, the carpet and the glass and the quiet corporate order of a place that had spent years maintaining a surface over everything that was wrong beneath it. "I want it to go all the way," she said. "I know you do," Cole said. "So do I." She hung up and looked at the time. 4:53, 7 minutes until the end of the official workday. She was still sitting there at 6. At 6:12, Gary knocked on her desk partition. He was in his coat, ready to leave, but he'd clearly detoured specifically to find her. "Board called an emergency session," he said. "You know about it?" "I heard something," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. 19 years, he said. "I never once thought this was possible." She looked at him. "What changed?" He thought about it. "You walked into his office on day 15, he said, with a single page of projections that you put on his desk, and you asked him to consider something." He paused. "I've been here 19 years, and I never once put a piece of paper on his desk. I convinced myself there was no point." He shook his head slightly. "You did it on day 15 because you didn't know yet that there was no point. And then when he told you there was no point, you decided not to believe him." She thought about that. Or maybe she said, "It was easier for me because I didn't come in alone, even when it looked like I did." Gary looked at her. He understood what she meant. "Your dad," he said. "My dad," she said. "And all of you, every person who talked to me in a break room or a parking lot or at 11 o'clock at night. I didn't do any of this alone. I was the one who started the sentence." Gary looked at her for a moment. Then he put his hand briefly on her desk, the same gesture he'd made in the conference room. The contact with the furniture, instead of the person, the restraint of a man who expresses care in precise and limited ways. "Good night, Madison," he said. "Good night, Gary," she said. He left. She sat in the quiet of the nearly empty office and thought about what he'd said. You didn't know yet that there was no point, and she thought about all the things she hadn't known when she walked in on day one with her navy blazer that she'd ironed 3 times. She hadn't known about the 9 years or the 19 years or the altered board minutes or the buried safety reports or the NDA in Missoula or the 14 pages Ray wrote at 2 in the morning or the 6 pages Pete wrote in his blue Silverado during a lunch break. She hadn't known any of it. And maybe that was the only way it could have started. Maybe it required someone who didn't yet know the weight of the thing who walked into the room before understanding fully what the room could do to a person. Her phone lit up, a text from Hargrove's attorney, Diane Foss. It said, "OSHA acknowledged, inspector assigned, site visit within 72 hours. Board session confirmed for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. You'll want to be there." She read it twice. Then she called Cole. Second ring. "Tomorrow morning," as she said, 9 o'clock, board session. A pause, not the thinking pause, something different, something that sounded through a phone like a man who had been carrying something for his daughter and was now watching her carry it herself. "I'll be there," he said. "That," she said, "you don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Okay," she said. She ended the call. She sat in the empty office in the particular quiet of an ending and a beginning, existing in exactly the same moment. The building around her, still the same building it had been on the first morning she walked into it, and also in every way that actually mattered, not the same at all. Somewhere in his closed office, Richard Whitmore didn't know yet about the OSHA inspector. He was about to find out what it felt like to not know something important. She picked up her bag. She turned off her desk lamp, and she walked out into the night to get ready for tomorrow. She didn't sleep much, but when she woke up at 5:40, she didn't feel tired. There's a kind of alertness that isn't about rest, it's about readiness. Madison had felt it once before the morning of her job interview at Blackridge, when she'd ironed her blazer 3 times, not because she was nervous, but because she understood that the day mattered and she wanted to meet it fully. This morning was like that, but different. That morning she had been trying to get into a room. This morning she was going back into one she'd already changed. She showered, she dressed, she made coffee and stood at her kitchen counter and thought about the 9 o'clock board session and what it meant that Diane Foss had told her to be there. She thought about Richard in his closed office, about the moment yesterday when Carol Marsh had sat beside her desk instead of across from it, and what that repositioning had quietly announced. About Pete Callahan in his blue Silverado with 6 handwritten pages on the seat beside him. About Ray Dutton awake at 2 in the morning, writing 14 pages that were really 6 years of a life finally being given back to its owner. She thought about her father. She called him at 6:15. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear in the background the sound of his kitchen, the particular acoustic of that wide house he'd built with his own hands, the coffee maker running the morning, coming in through windows that faced east. "You ready?" he asked. No greeting. He always knew when she was calling with a purpose. "I think so," she said. "Dad, the board session. I want to handle it myself." Silence. Brief. "I know," he said. "I mean, I want you there. I just don't want you to speak for me." "Madison," he said, and his voice had the quality of something both gentle and certain. "When have I ever spoken for you?" She thought about that, really thought about it. The lobby meeting with Richard Cole had asked questions, not delivered verdicts. The restaurant with Hargrove Cole had sat back and let her drive. The phone calls after each escalation, he'd given her information and then waited to see what she decided to do with it. He had never once spoken for her. He had only ever made sure she wasn't speaking into empty air. "You've never spoken for me," she said. "That's right," he said. "I'll be there. Bobby and Cruz too, probably. But we'll be outside. You walk into that room on your own." "Okay," she said. "Madison." "Yeah." 19 days, he said. "You've been there 19 days. She understood what he was saying, not bragging, not reassuring, just marking it the specific, remarkable fact of it. 19 days and the board of a major Montana company was meeting an emergency session. "I know," she said quietly. "Your grandmother would have had something to say about that," he said. "Something loud and embarrassing in the best possible way." She laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in days, and it loosened something in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. "Go get ready," he said. "I'll see you there." She arrived at Black Ridge at 8:30, earlier than usual. The building was not yet at full capacity, the parking lot half full, the lobby quiet except for Donna at the front desk, who looked up when Madison pushed through the door and did something she hadn't done in any of the 19 mornings before this one. She stood up, not because she had to, not because protocol required it. She just stood up and she looked at Madison and she said, "Good morning." And the way she said it was different from every previous good morning. It was level unguarded, the greeting of a person who had made a decision and was standing in it. "Good morning, Donna," Madison said. Donna sat back, yawned, but she kept her eyes on Madison for a moment longer, the look of someone who needed to see where a person was going to know that the direction was real. Madison took the elevator to the second floor. She found Janet already at her desk, which was not unusual except that Janet's desk today had something on it that had not been there before, a neat stack of papers, organized with paper clips dated and labeled in Janet's precise handwriting. 9 years of memory, organized, ready. Janet looked up. "I made copies," she said. "Hargrove's attorney has a set. Carol Marsh has a set." She paused. "I kept one for myself." "Good," Madison said. "I didn't sleep," Janet said. "Neither did I." "Are you scared?" Janet asked. Madison thought about the honest answer. "Of what happens if this doesn't work?" "Yeah, a little." She paused. "But more scared of what happens if we don't try." Janet nodded slowly. "That's yes." She looked at the papers on her desk. "That's exactly it." The board session was scheduled for the Meridian Room, the large formal conference space on the 4th floor that was used for board meetings, major client presentations, and events, significant enough to require the company's best table and its best chairs. Madison had never been in it. She'd heard people mention it the way people mention rooms they don't normally have access to, with a slight reverence that was really a description of exclusion. She got there at 8:55. The room was already occupied. 4 board members sat along one side of the table, 3 men and a woman ranging from late 50s to early 70s. All of them with the careful composure of people who understood that today was a day that would be documented and that how they behaved in it would be part of a record. Carol Marsh sat at the near end of the table with two associates from her firm. Hargrove's attorney, Diane Foss, sat on the opposite side with a leather portfolio in front of her, in the particular stillness of a woman who had been in rooms like this many times and had learned that stillness was its own form of strength. Daniel Hargrove was there. He caught Madison's eye when she entered and gave her a short nod, the nod of a man who had spent 15 months sitting with regret and had finally found a use for it. Richard Whitmore was at the head of the table. He looked at her when she walked in. Something moved across his face, something fast, quickly controlled. He had not expected her. He had expected this to be a board-level conversation that happened above her, over her, without her, the kind of conversation that people at his level had always had about people at other levels, without the other levels present. The board member at the center, a man named Arthur Vance, who had been on the Blackridge board for 11 years, and who Madison would later learn had been quietly troubled, for the last three of them looked at her and then at Carol Marsh. "This is Madison Carter," Carol said. "She's the employee whose initial complaint precipitated the labor board filing. I've asked her to be available to the board directly." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is irregular," he said. "Yes," Arthur Vance said. "It is. So is an OSHA referral for an active safety risk that apparently has been unresolved for 2 years." He looked at Richard steadily. "Sit down, Richard." The room shifted in a single breath, because Arthur Vance had just said sit down to Richard Whitmore, in Richard's company, at Richard's table. And the word had landed not as a request, but as a fact, the way things land when the person saying them has enough authority and enough evidence behind them to make the word mean exactly what it says. Richard sat, Madison sat across from him, and the board session began. The next 90 minutes were not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no explosions. No one raised their voice. The documentation was presented methodically. Hargrove's altered board minutes, the rerouted safety complaints, Patricia's testimony, Ray's 14 pages, Pete's 6 pages, Marcus's formal statement, Janet's 9 years of organized memory. Carol Marsh presented a summary of her own investigation from the previous 24 hours, which had moved with a speed that told Madison Carol Marsh had been looking for a reason to move quickly and had found one. Richard spoke, he denied, he characterized. He used the same language he'd used in the all-staff meeting: personal disputes, baseless allegations, contentious departures. He was still good at it, the performance was still intact, but the room was different from the rooms he'd performed in before. This room had Diane Foss, who responded to each characterization with a specific source-dated piece of documentation. This room had Arthur Vance, who asked questions that were not rhetorical but precise. The questions of a man building a record rather than looking for an excuse. This room had Carol Marsh, who had repositioned herself, who was no longer protecting the company from a complaint, but protecting the company from itself, which was a different assignment entirely, and one she pursued with the focused energy of a professional who had recognized a critical juncture. And this room had Madison. She spoke twice, not long, not emotional. When Diane Foss asked her to describe the initial conversation with Richard, the overtime memo, the office meeting, the specific phrase, she described it in 3 sentences. Accurate, specific, without embellishment. When Arthur Vance asked her directly whether she believed the incidents she documented represented a pattern rather than isolated events, she said yes, and the number of people willing to speak after years of silence suggests the pattern was well understood by the people who experienced it. They just didn't believe anyone who was listening. The room was quiet after that. Richard looked at her across the table. It was a different look from any he'd given her before. The assessment was still there. Richard would never fully stop assessing, but something underneath it had collapsed. The absolute certainty, the bedrock conviction that he could manage any room he sat in, that the tools that had always worked would keep working, that the words that had always silenced people would silence them again. I was looking at a 22-year-old woman who had been at his company for 19 days, and he was understanding fully for the first time that she had not walked into his office on day 15 out of ignorance or naivety or a failure to understand how the room worked. She had walked in because she understood exactly how it worked, and she had decided it was wrong. At 10:41, the board asked Richard to leave the room. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the door with the bearing of a man who has spent 60 years deciding how he looks when he walks, and he opened it and he left. The door closed. Arthur Vance looked around the table. Recommendations, he said. Diane Foss spoke first. Carol Marsh spoke second. The other board members spoke in order. Madison sat and listened, and what she heard was not the dramatic pronouncement of justice that movies would have delivered. It was something more true and more complicated than that. It was a group of people working through the real specific consequences of a real specific failure of leadership, trying to do it correctly and quickly because the alternative was worse. By 11:15, the board had voted. Richard Whitmore was removed as CEO of Black Ridge Outdoor Industries, effective immediately pending a full independent audit of the company's HR and safety compliance practices. His employment contract would be reviewed for provisions related to misconduct. The overtime policy revision was suspended and returned to committee for proper stakeholder review. The warehouse equipment flagged in the OSHA referral was to be taken out of service within 24 hours pending inspection. And a new interim leadership structure was to be announced to staff by end of day. Arthur Vance looked at Madison when it was done. "Thank you for being here," he said. She nodded. She didn't say, "You're welcome." That felt wrong, too close to claiming credit for something that had been built by many hands. She said, "Thank the people who talked." She walked out of the Meridian room and took the elevator down to the lobby. Cole was standing outside the building, not right at the door, back a little, in the way he always positioned himself in situations that weren't his, to lead present, but not crowding. Bobby and Cruz were near the bikes in the parking lot, far enough to give Cole space close enough to be visible. Cole looked at her when she came out. He read her face the way he'd always read her face, the particular parental fluency of a man who had been paying attention to his daughter's expressions for 22 years and could distinguish between the look of someone who had won and the look of someone who had done something right, and understood that those were not always the same thing. "It's done," she said. I didn't say anything. He put his arm around her shoulders briefly in the compact way of a man who expresses things physically, but not extravagantly. The squeeze and release of a father who is proud and doesn't have the right words for it and knows that the touch says it better anyway. She let herself lean into that for exactly 1 second. Then she straightened. "I have to go back in," she said. "People are going to need to hear what happened from someone they trust." "Go," he said. She turned back toward the door. Then she stopped. "Dad." "Yeah." "That thing you said to me that night on the phone when I called you from the parking lot." She turned to look at him. "You said, 'Where are you?' Like it was the most obvious thing, like the question was already answered before I finished asking it." Cole looked at her. "It was," he said simply. "You're my daughter. There isn't a version of that call where I don't come." She held that for a moment. "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I know." She went back inside. The announcement went out to staff at 2 o'clock. An all-staff email signed by Arthur Vance, brief and specific, naming the board's decision and the immediate changes. No spin, no corporate language designed to obscure. Just the facts stated plainly, which was itself a message, a statement about what kind of company Black Ridge was going to try to be starting now. Madison was at her desk when the email arrived. She watched the office around her read it in the particular collective silence of people processing something they have hoped for so long that the actual arrival of it doesn't feel real at first. Trevor read it twice. Then he put his face in his hands for a moment, not in distress, she thought, but in the physical expression of a tension that had been held so long its sudden release had to go somewhere. Gary appeared in the corridor between the warehouse and the main floor. He read something on his phone. He looked up. Across the room he found Madison's eyes. He nodded, slow, deep. The nod of a man who has waited 19 years for something and is taking a full second to actually feel it arrive. Donna called her desk line at 2:17. "I read it," she said. Her voice was different, lighter somehow, and also not entirely steady in the way that things are not steady when the weight you've been carrying is lifted and your body has to remember how to stand without it. "Madison, I read it." "I know," Madison said. "I've been at this desk for 11 years, Donna said. 11 years, and she stopped. "I should have said something a long time ago." "Donna," Madison said quietly, "you said something now. That's not nothing. That's not small." A pause. "My daughter called me this morning," Donna said. "I didn't tell her what was happening, but she called just to check on me the way she does. And I thought about what I would want for her. If she were in a place like this, What I would want her to do. Her voice was thick. I would want her to do exactly what you did. Madison didn't have an answer for that. She let it sit. After a moment, Donna said, "Thank you." "Thank yourself," Madison said. "You stayed, and when it mattered, you told me the truth." She hung up. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the afternoon, the particular quality of an afternoon that feels different from the morning. It came from that has been changed by what happened between the two. At 3:30, Marcus Webb texted her. "They took the equipment offline. Hour ago, Pete and me watched them do it." She read it and felt something move through her that wasn't triumph. Triumph was too clean, too simple for what this was. What she felt was the particular relief of knowing that the 23-year-old who worked that line would go home tonight and tomorrow and the day after with one less invisible danger in his workday. That the 9-year-old and the 7-year-old would keep having a father who came home with all his fingers. That the near miss that had stayed a near miss for 2 years because one man's instinct for self-protection mattered more than the bodies of the people around him, that it would not become something else. She texted back, "Good. Get some rest this weekend. Marcus, you too. And Madison, whatever they offer you next. Make sure it's what you want, not just what they need." She read that twice. At 4:55, Arthur Vance stopped by her desk. He was getting his coat on end of day, the first day of a company trying to figure out what it was going to be. "The board is going to be discussing leadership structure over the next few weeks," he said. "There will be conversations about people who demonstrated integrity during a difficult time." He paused carefully. "I want you to know that your name will come up." "Mr. Vance," she said, "I appreciate that. But I want to be clear, if a role comes to me, I want it to come on the merits of the work, not because of what happened this week." He looked at her for a moment. "I understand," he said. "I'd expect nothing less." He walked away. She turned off her computer. She gathered her things. She put on her jacket and picked up her bag and stood at her desk for a moment. The desk she had sat at for 19 days in a building she had walked into, not knowing what she was walking into, with a single-page memo she'd prepared, and a question she'd decided not to leave unasked. She walked to the elevator. On the way, she passed the door that had always been open, the door to the corner office that was now dark, now empty. The chair pushed back at an angle that suggested departure. She didn't stop. She rode the elevator down. In the lobby, Donna looked up from her desk and said goodnight, in a voice that had something new in it. Not drama, not ceremony, just the simple, steady weight of a person who had decided to take up their full space again. "Good night, Donna," Madison said. She pushed through the front door. Cole was gone. She told him to go, that she'd call tonight, that there was nothing left here that required him to stand in a parking lot. But as she walked to her car, she got a text from him. It said, "Proud of you. Call me when you're home." She stood in the parking lot for a moment with the phone in her hand. 19 days. She had been here 19 days. She thought about the navy blazer she'd ironed 3 times. She thought about the $11,000 error she'd found because she was reading files to understand how the place worked, not to prove anything to anyone. She thought about Gary's hands flat on the table, and Donna getting smaller, and Janet's upward inflection slowly becoming something more solid, and Marcus's 2 kids, and Pete's gray mustache, and handwritten 6 pages. And Ray awake at 2 in the morning, finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying since before he knew he was carrying it. She thought about her father standing outside the building, not at the door back, a little present but not crowding there without being the story. She thought about Remember Your Place, and she understood, standing in that parking lot in the cooling Montana evening, that the place she had always belonged was exactly where she had put herself. Not because someone gave it to her, not because her father's name made the ground soft beneath her feet, but because she had walked into a room prepared and refused to walk back out smaller than she'd gone in. She had started a sentence that a lot of people had needed someone to start. And when the room finally answered, it answered with 19 years and 9 years and 11 years and 6 years and 2 years and 6 pages and 14 pages and 11 names on a list and one woman in Missoula who couldn't speak but knew how to point. The answer had been waiting a long time. It just needed someone willing to ask the question out loud. Madison Carter put her phone in her pocket, walked to her car, and drove home through the Montana evening. A 22-year-old woman who had walked into the wrong building on the right day, asked the right question at exactly the right moment, and refused at every step to accept the answer that power had always counted on her to accept. That refusal, quiet, prepared, and completely unafraid of the case, was the only thing that had ever needed to change. And it had.